A chilly Apache girl receives a blanket from the cowboy. Her tribe claims that he recently wedded her the following day. What began because Boone Cartwright would find himself in a predicament that no amount of gunfighting expertise could resolve, because to a simple act of charity. However, all he saw that night was a young woman dying in the snow as the wind howled through the canyon. The tempest had been transforming the Alpine Pass into an icy wasteland since sunrise. Boone tightened his coat as through the deepening snow the horse struggled. For 3 days in a row he had been advancing toward the trading post, prior to the worsening weather. His breath was sharply white as the cold pricked his leather gloves. Clouds, he noticed her then. A figure crouched behind a rock, just barely shifting. He initially believed it might be an animal in need of a place to stay. However, as he approached, the form turned into distinctly human. Probably little older than 19, a young Apache woman curled dressed in a flimsy high dress made of deer that provided little defense against the freezing weather. Her mouth was blue, her whole body trembled uncontrollably. Boone got off without a second thought. He would saw enough fatalities to know when someone was about to pass over. The woman opened her eyes as he walked up. Dark, perceptive eyes that were resigned and fearless. She was in a way that tightened his chest. It was gorgeous. However, she was dying now. He reflected on the tales he had heard in saloons concerning Apache raiders and the bloodshed that ensued wherever they encountered settlers. Concerning there were unwritten frontier laws that stated that assisting the wrong person could result in your death. However, observing her from below, those cautions seemed far away and pointless. Boone took the heavy wool blanket off his sleeping roll and unraveled it. It was his greatest asset, the sole source of warmth on chilly trek evenings. It was handcrafted by his grandmother, years prior to her being taken by the fever. Even though the gray and blue design had faded, it retained heat better than anything else. He put the blanket around the woman's trembling shoulders without saying anything. She gazed up at him with amazement, as though a white man's generosity was the last thing she had anticipated. Cold, stiffened fingers clutched gratefully at the blanket's edges. He whispered, "You'll be all right," even though he wasn't positive she could understand English. The warmth returned to the woman's body and her breathing stabilized. Her cheeks gradually restored their color. She examining his face with those dark, piercing eyes, they briefly shared something that neither of them entirely understood. "I got it." Boone assisted her in standing up and led her to a more secure location behind the rocks. He constructed a tiny fire, sharing his meager food supply. "Ayana," the woman remarked, pointing to herself, ate carefully without once taking her away from him. She appeared to be learning his face by heart. They sat in the storm while it raged all around them. Cozy quiet. Boone couldn't help but stare at her, curious in her tale. How had she found herself by herself in a snowstorm? Her family was where? Nevertheless, those inquiries would have to wait. When the sun eventually came up, Ayana got up and folded the blanket gently. Boone shook his head when she offered it. Now that the cold was over, he had his coat. He didn't need it as much as she did. His refusal to retract it caused her eyes to widen. She spoke quickly in Apache. She pointed at him after making a gesture between herself and the blanket. She spoke in a disturbed, frantic tone. However, Boone was unable to comprehend a single word. He simply grinned and got on his horse. As he rode off, he called back, "Keep warm," believing that he had done the right thing and would never see her again. However, Ayana saw him vanish into the morning. Missed, she gripped the blanket more firmly. What had just transpired meant something much different in her society than what the good-hearted cowboy thought. By dusk, her people would arrive seeking solutions that would transform both their endures forever. By mid-afternoon, Boone had arrived at the trade post, his thoughts constantly repeating the Apache encounter. Female, there was something haunting about their eyes. Her expression when he declined to accept the blanket return, as if she were warning him of something. The trading post was situated in a pine forest valley. Trees, its stone chimney releasing smoke. The warmth inside struck him like a wall. Around a table, 3 other men were sipping whiskey and playing cards. The elderly man who betrayed Murphy, who was cleaning his rifle, looked up. Murphy responded, "Boone Cartwright," putting his gun down. "I didn't," Boone answered, unbuttoning his shirt. "I'll see you in the spring. That storm almost killed my horses. Had to push through." His coat. "I have urgent business in Santa Fe." Murphy poured coffee for him. The steaming black liquid and bitter. Feeling human again, Boone curled his icy hands around the tin cup. The warmth caused him to reflect. Of Ayanna, questioning whether she had reached safety. "Do you see any issues on the trail?" Among the card players, one inquired. A slender man with a scar across his jaw and anxious eyes. "These areas have been traversed by Apache. People are becoming frightened." Boone paused, his lips suddenly tasting sour from the coffee. He considered bringing up Ayanna, but something impeded his progress. These men would not comprehend. They would only perceive the threat, not the terrified young lady who was almost paralyzed. "Nothing I couldn't handle," he responded at last. The man with scars reclined in his seat. It was wise to keep going. "They struck a wagon train 20 meters south last week, took everything, and left the dead for the animals, all of them." Boone's mouth buzzards. He spat into a brass spittoon. Constricted, he recalled Ayanna's appreciative smile, and the word "animals" replayed in his mind. Whatever those raiders, Murphy refilled his cup and said, "You can bunk here." She was a woman who had needed assistance, not involved in what he had done. "I have a room in the back tonight, but if I were you, I would go as soon as it was light. I've been listening to drumming in the hills." Trouble ensues as they begin drumming. As though prompted by his words, a steady beat floated through the valley. Low, the poker game came to a halt, and everyone's gaze shifted to the scarred guy murmured, "There it is again," even though all that was seen were the fading windows. "Been going on for hours." With a chilly knot in his gut, Boone put down his cup. The drumming was not sporadic. It appeared to be emanating from many directions throughout the valley. There seemed to be a pattern to it, such as a discussion, in a language he couldn't comprehend. "Perhaps they're just passing," Murphy responded, "through," but his hand automatically went to his rifle. The drumming ceased suddenly, and Boone found himself pondering as the ensuing silence was heavier than the music itself. Pondered the blanket once again about Ayanna's frantic tone of voice, and whether she was attempting to convey a message to him. Boone finished his coffee in a single drink and replied, "I'll take that room, important." However, as he climbed into the small bunk that night, he was unable to fall asleep. The drumming had resumed near this. He might swear he heard his name being called somewhere in that rhythm. Outside his window, shadows passed between the trees, not the haphazard motion of animals, but the deliberate approach of individuals who were fully aware of Boone, had a strong feeling that they were searching for him, so he went with them. Dawn also arrived, early and too peaceful. Before daybreak, the drumming had ceased, leaving an unusual hush that made even the birds were hesitant to sing, and Boone's skin crawled. He hurriedly put on his clothes and went out to see how his horse was doing. Murphy came out of the main structure with his rifle in hand, and the beast was restless, its ears twitching at sounds that only it could hear. Murphy's old face was marked with anxiety and a hand. "They're out there," he murmured softly. "Been watching us throughout the night." Boone looked around the tree line, but nothing moved. But he could sense eyes on him even though he hadn't seen them. As he saddled his horse, his sense of being watched was palpable, like being in front of a loaded rifle. "I'm riding out, Boone. I'm calm and purposeful. Panic would just make things worse," said. "You're crazy," the scarred man muttered from the doorway. "There's no point staying here if they want something." Boone was already mounting, but they said, "They'll pick you off before you reach the ridge." Whatever was going there, he rode carefully up, realizing that hiding wouldn't solve the problem and that he would rather face it head-on than wait to be cornered like a mouse. Hands out and away from his weapons on the main trail, the morning mist clinging to the valley level, making everything appear ethereal and unsure. The sole sound in the deafening silence was the hoofs of his horse resonating off the canyon walls. 7 Apache warriors emerged from the trees like shaped shadows, and they didn't move quickly or their horses were decorated for battle, and they just moved into sight and waited, blocking the path ahead. Conflict, but the men themselves appeared. Composed, almost ritualistic. Boone's hand automatically went for his rifle, then halted. These weren't raiders. One of them, an older man with elaborate beading on his shirt, lifted his hand. His posture was formal but not menacing, in a motion that was unmistakably stop. Boone's heart pounded against his ribs as he reined in his horse. With a voice full of authority, Apache spoke in his native dialect, and the other warriors stayed behind him. They were still, their dark eyes examining Boone with such rigor that he felt like a specimen in a glass case. Then Ayanna, who was wearing the same deer, appeared behind the group. Boone's blue and gray blanket, which she had thrown over her shoulders like a ceremonial cloak, replaced the hide outfit. Her eyes met own, and he noticed something there that chilled him, not thankfulness or dread, but accountability. Heavily, inevitable duty. The elder Apache continued, and this time Ayanna she spoke English with precision, but with a touch of accent that gave every phrase a melodic quality. She answered simply, "Grandfather, you have claimed me as your wife." Boone's horse moved under him as though in response to his surprise. "What? I never used the blanket." Ayanna went on, her voice becoming louder, stronger. In our culture, a guy demonstrates his determination to provide for a lady by offering his blanket to protect her. Boone gazed as the words struck him like a physical blow. To be her husband. Always at his grandmother's blanket, which had now been changed into something he had never wanted it to be, a marriage. "That's not what I meant," he added frantically, "but I was just trying." The contract was written in wool and with good intentions. "To assist," Ayanna's grandfather said once again, his voice unyielding. Ayanna translated, but her voice had grown weaker and more flimsy. "States, actions are more important than intentions. You claimed me as your own and saved my life? You now have to respect that decision." As the entire gravity of Boone's predicament became apparent, the canyon walls appeared to press in around him. Straightforward, he was linked by an act of compassion to a woman he hardly knew in a culture he didn't comprehend, with unknowable implications. Boone's lips became as dry as dust, and 7 sets of eyes watched him, waiting for a response that would decide if he survived to witness another sunset. Suddenly, the morning air felt light, requiring deliberate effort to breathe. "I don't understand your ways," Boone stated cautiously, his voice resonating off the canyon cliffs. "In my culture, offering someone a blanket just indicates that you don't want them to." Ayanna's grandfather, whom she referred to as Niche, heard the translation and gave a question-like response, his aged face remaining neutral while his eyes, asking whether he would have offered the blanket. He possesses the acuity of a guy who has survived by reading people's hearts. Ayanna interpreted, her voice scarcely audible above a whisper. "To an Apache man." The question got right to the point. Boone honestly considered whether he would have stopped for an Apache warrior. The answer weighed heavily on his chest. Probably. Risked his own warmth for someone who might have been his enemy. Not, he confessed. Nalnish nodded as though this validated what he already knew, and he continued, his words flowing. Ancient and definite like river over stones. "You chose to see me as a woman first, Apache second," he says. "This honor is shown, but it comes with responsibility." One of the younger fighters shifted uneasily on as Boone noticed the movement. As the horse's hand moved to rest on his weapon and felt perspiration run down his back. Even though it was cold in the morning, these men weren't merely there to chat. Whatever the case, they were here to impose their traditions. The price, "What occurs if I decline?" Ayanna paused when Boone inquired, even though he believed he already knew the answer, before interpreting. A number of warriors joined in the quick-paced, heated discussion that ensued. Observing their expressions, attempting to decipher the feelings concealed in incomprehensible words, Ayanna's my face had turned pale. "You are dishonoring my family as well as myself if you refuse." "Grandfather would be required to restore our honor through," she said, pausing to find the appropriate English words. The menace hung in the air like funeral smoke, and Boone turned to face each warrior, observing the blood, resolve in their features. They weren't playing a bluff. This wasn't negotiable in their world. Then he turned to face Ayanna. He looked at her closely and saw that she was proud and upright, yet he could sense that she was afraid of what would worry for him. Worry about her family's safety in the event of violence? Fear of being torn between two worlds that, in order to preserve your life, you would accept a marriage, but if you were Boone, you would trap an innocent woman? Or decline and probably begin a conflict that could end up destroying you both? Please let me know in the comments. I must know whose side you support, as Boone's next decision would not only define his own fate, but also the fate of There Must Be Another Way. Boone remarked at last, "Some test or trial I can do." Everyone was standing in that canyon. Instead, now Nish's brows went up a little, the initial split in his stony face. He addressed Ayanna, who was taken aback by his answer. "Says, this is surprising. You speak like a warrior, not a coward." She hesitated. "He'll think about what you say, but first you have to come to our community to know what you're really selecting." Clearly disapproving of this choice, the young warrior who had been fingering his sword remarked sternly, silenced him with a stern expression and a tone like to a reprimand. "My cousin feels that you ought to be made to make a decision." Ayanna clarified, "He believes that if you have time, you will attempt to flee." Boone met he could see the barely restrained violence in the young warrior's furious look, and he was motivated to find a solution, with blood rather than words. One misstep, one disrespectful gesture, and this canyon would turn into a battleground. "I promise you," Boone replied. "Speaking to, I won't run," Nish said directly. As Ayanna interpreted, Boone understood he had accepted to enter an Apache, committing himself to something far riskier than a straightforward marriage proposal. Village full of people who had every reason to despise him, to endure traditions and hardships that he couldn't even imagine, but one idea kept coming to him as they rode farther into the mountains. He was no longer attempting to save his own life, but somehow, without intending to, he had also taken on the responsibility of saving Ayanna's. Nestled in a valley between towering red mountains, the Apache community emerged from the scenery like a mirage coming to life. It was bigger than Boone had anticipated, with dozens of traditional homes strewn around a crystal-clear stream, with children's laughter resonating off the canyon walls and smoke rising from cooking fires. Yet when their group as they got closer, the laughter ceased, and faces emerged from behind trees and indoors, including men, women, and kids. Observing the white guy who rode among their warriors, some faces were inquisitive, while others were barely hiding their faces. Boone felt like a wolf entering a sheep enclosure, but he wasn't sure who was the predator in this situation. Nullnish. Lead logs were piled in a circle around a large fire pit in the middle of the village, and an old woman came from the biggest house, her eyes as keen as obsidian, her silver hair braided with turquoise beads, and with a force that caused Boone to turn away. "My grandma," Ayanna uttered softly. "Imala?" "She is not." Imala motioned at Boone and spoke quickly to Nalnish, her voice rising with what was obviously fury. Several times her words pierced the air like blades of a knife, and other villagers started to assemble, creating a Boone remarked, "What's she saying?" as she made a rough circle around the fire pit. Ayanna's face flushed with shame. "She claims that bringing you here puts the entire town in a bad mood and that you smell like liquor and violence." She hesitated before continuing, saying, "I have shamed our family by accepting gifts from a stranger." Boone could now distinguish individual voices as the gathering became larger and more angry, with some demanding and others disagreeing. A young man his own age stepped forward and addressed Ayanna directly, clearly passionately, and she shook her head over and again, but he continued, "Who's that?" Boone inquired, but the man's envious gaze made the response evident. Ayanna's voice was, "Keurig, he has asked for my hand many times." Almost inaudible, he declares, "This is a trick to avoid marrying him." Keurig approaches Boone, placing his hand on. He spoke in English, his words heavily accented yet understandable. "And you?" Take what is not yours. Get out of here, white man, or I'll clip your liar's tongue. Caused tension to rise in the crowd, and Boone felt the weight of everyone's attention on him. One offensive utterance, one move, and any possibility of a peaceful resolution would be destroyed by the violence that would ensue. I didn't take anything, Boone stated coolly. I contributed. Something has changed. Keurik's face clouded. You sacrificed nothing. You took advantage of holy traditions for your own gain. And then you fled back to your people. Enjoy the story. Please subscribe to the channel. Imala interrupted Boone before he could reply. Abruptly to Keurig, who grudgingly retreated but kept his gaze fixed on Boone's face. And then she focused on Ayana's shoulders slumped as she listened to her granddaughter, her voice laden with disappointment. After Imala ended, Ayana muttered, "She says I must pick," as tears sparkled in the young woman's eyes. "Either demonstrate that you are honorable by finishing the marriage trials, or own my folly and agree to Keurik's proposal." "The marital trials," Boone said, feeling sick to his stomach. "What type of trials?" "3 tests," Ayana said, her voice growing louder as she said it. "Song, discernment, and selflessness." She didn't have to complete if she failed any of them. The adversarial faces around them were a testament to the alternative. The audience grew hushed as Nalnish spoke once again. His speech had the weight of the law itself. According to him, the trials start around dusk. Ayana did the translation. "Additionally, if you attempt, Keurig has the right to pursue you if you depart before they're done." Boone surveyed the group of faces, a few hopeful, while some are waiting for him to fail. But he made up his mind based on Ayana's expression. Behind the anxiety and despite his doubts, he noticed something that made him remember why he had initially given her the blanket. She was worth fighting for and defending, even if he wasn't really sure why. "Then I guess we'd better get started," he said. The whole town gathered around the main fire as the sun started to set behind the canyon walls. On the redstone cliffs, flames created swirling shadows that transformed the serene valley into something primordial and old. Standing at the periphery of the circle, Boone observed the Apache getting ready for what seemed more like a funeral than a marriage ceremony. Nalnish came over with 3 things: a substantial rope, a small leather pouch that clinked lightly when he walked, and a piece of carved wood covered in symbols. He established his voice echoed over the crackling flames as he spoke to them down by the fire. "The initial trial tests your strength," Ayana, who was standing next to Boone, translated. "You have to ascend the holy cliff face with just the rope. Make it to the eagle's nest, and return with a feather." Boone gazed up at the imposing stone wall that rose behind him. The community. He could see even in the dimming light that it was almost vertical, with loose rock and few handholds that would disintegrate when weighed down. About 60 feet up, the eagle's nest was a dark smudge that was dangerously high. "Males have died," trying to add the Ayana in a subtle way. "Sometimes even our own soldiers fall short." Keurig moved forward and said loudly, enough to be heard by all. He made a contemptuous motion toward the cliff, implying that the white man where Apache warriors had failed, they would never succeed. Translated by Ayana, he says you will fall like a stone, that a whiskey bottle is the hardest object your delicate hands have ever handled. It hurt that the insult wasn't completely incorrect. Rope climbing was not exactly a cowboy specialty, but Boone was strong enough. However, he'd been in more difficult situations. He hoped he had anyway. The chilly chill struck him as he took off his hat and coat, his flesh. The rough hemp rope had been smoothed in spots by earlier climbers. He felt its strength when he tested it, the weight of all the village's eyes on him. The first 20 feet went more smoothly than anticipated. His arms, and although his shoulders burned, he was unaware of the strength he possessed due to years of working on the ranch. The rope sank into his blood from his palms, yet he continued to ascend, one hand over the other, unboots scurrying up the cliff wall to buy them. His luck ran out halfway up. A piece of granite fell away. He was left swinging freely on the rope beneath his feet. The people below let forth a gasp. And, someone screamed, possibly Ayana. Boone's shoulders let out a protesting scream as they absorbed his entire weight. He hung there for a minute, slowly spinning while gazing down at the faces below. Keurig was grinning, already expecting him to fail, but he was propelled forward by Ayana's gaze. Not alarm, but strong resolve, as though she were using her own willpower to scale the cliff. Boone established new footholds, and he went on climbing. Overhead the eagle's nest loomed, a maze of sticks and bones constructed on a small ledge. A huge golden eagle emerged from the darkness as he grabbed for it, its wings pounding and its talons outstretched wildly all over his head. The bird screeched in indignation and he dodged, almost losing his hold. It has rad talons across his shoulder, pulling blood and ripping his shirt. However, ensnared in the nest's prickly branches was one flawless feather. Boone snatched it up and started down, his muscles shaking from fatigue. Each step down was pain, but he wouldn't let go. His legs gave way as soon as his boots struck the earth and he fell to the ground. His knees, there was a startled murmur in the village. Keurig became even more shocked at the white man had accomplished. With its golden-brown surface shining in the firelight, Boone held out the eagle feather. Nalnish took the feather and gave it a close inspection before giving his nod of approval. After a brief exchange of words, Ayana interpreted which she sounded clearly relieved. He claimed that despite the eagle's resistance, you persisted. The initial trial is finished. Nevertheless, Nalnish scooped up the carved wooden item before Boone could gather his breath. It was covered in complex symbols that appeared to move and dance in the light of the fire. The second trial evaluates your wisdom, Ayana murmured, her tone becoming strained once more. You have to figure out the puzzle of the ancestral stone before it is reduced to embers by the fire. Boone glanced at the fire, then at the symbols. It was big now, but the dry mountain air made wood burn quickly. He might have an hour, probably less. What if I am unable to fix it? He inquired. Ayana paused. You have then failed 2 trials, and failure indicates that she did not complete. However, Keurig wrote the response in his enthusiastic expression. Success was becoming increasingly improbable, and failure meant death. Boone was gazing at the ancestral stone, attempting to interpret symbols that could as well have been written by extraterrestrials. One idea reverberated in his thoughts. When you don't even grasp the language used to write a riddle, how do you solve it? Boone rotated the engraved stone over in his bloodied hands, examining the ancient mystery of the symbols that seemed to taunt him. The blaze crackled lower. He was getting closer to failure with every dying spark. The folks whispered among themselves around the circle. Some of them shook their heads, as though his defeat was already inevitable. He had never seen symbols like these before. Previously, some appeared to be creatures, including a bear, an eagle, and even a snake. Others looked like natural features, the sun, moon, rivers, and mountains. However, how they interacted, what the tale they told, was as unbreakable as the cliff he had just scaled. Can you give me a hint? Boone pleaded with Ayana. With sincere sorrow in her eyes, she shook her head. The trial of wisdom must be finished by yourself. We would both be dishonored if we assisted you. From the other side of the fire, Keurig's voice overflowing with contentment. Boone knew he was prematurely declaring victory even without translation. Numerous the peasants gave a nod of assent. Lower the fire burned. There was not much time left. Boone, he made himself think differently. Perhaps the answer lay not in deciphering Apache glyphs, but rather in being aware of universal truths. There were tales and patterns in every civilization that persisted throughout space and time. He examined the stone once more, searching for recognizable features. In the middle there, a spiral that can symbolize the changing of the seasons. The animals he had previously recognized around it, but now he noticed they were placed in a certain order. Place the bear where the summer sun would be. Where would it be, eagle? Spring. Where autumn would fall, snake. Seasons, he whispered. It concerns the seasons. However, that couldn't be the entire solution. Other aspects and symbols weren't consistent with the seasonal pattern. There was a human-like figure in the middle of the spiral, with lines extending from the human figure to every animal. Then it dawned on him. Seasons aside, the interaction between people and the natural world throughout the seasons. During the summer, they hunted bears to store food. When they needed it, the eagle for spring strength to develop and expand. When they leave their old ways in preparation for the next winter, the snake for autumn snakes shed their skin. Additionally, he had overlooked the symbol for winter in the fourth position. Previously, it appeared to be a blanket or even a shelter, but it wasn't an animal, something that was warm and protective. His heart pounded as the world grew chilly. This wasn't only a season's riddle. It was about his journey to this location and his experience. The Boon stated out loud, his voice echoing over the abrupt silence. The riddle isn't asking what the symbols mean. Circle, I'm being asked why I'm here. Holding the stone toward Nish, he rose to his feet. Every symbol denotes a decision. Bear, the decision to forcefully take what you need. Eagle, the decision to fly high people who are in pain. Snake, the decision to abdicate your obligations when circumstances become difficult. He stopped, staring straight at Ayana, the blanket, and the decision to provide warmth despite the expense. There were only glowing embers left from the fire. However, Nish stopped the trial by raising his hand. He talked rapidly to Ayana, who appeared taken aback by Boon's response. She translated it as follows. You understand that wisdom isn't about knowing our symbols, but about knowing yourself. The 4 options a man has when confronted with another's sorrow are depicted in the ancestor stone, and you choose the cover. The gathering echoed with murmurs, and Keurig was taken aback. However, Nalnish had not yet finished speaking. The second trial is finished, Ayana went on, but according to her grandfather, the third trial is the most dangerous. It tests your heart, not your body or mind. Nish took up the leather pouch, and the sound of it clinking seemed to threatening in the approaching darkness. Upon opening it, Boon discovered little bones, including finger bones engraved with more symbols. Ayana muttered, the trial of sacrifice. You have to decide what you're prepared to forfeit in order to obtain what you say you desire. As the bones were strewn across the floor in patterns that only Nalish could as he read, Boon understood that just getting through the first 2 trials would have been simple given what was about to happen. Would ask him to consider what he really desired and what he was, the one thing he had been avoiding since this whole thing started, eager to pay for it. The bone casting took a long time, and Nalish looked at the pattern intently. The town held its collective breath as he eventually read life and death in fragmented pieces. The bones have chosen the sacrifice, he said, his words laden with the weight of old law. Ayana translated, her voice almost heard. You can't claim what you want until you give up what you value most in this world. Nish grinned. What if I don't know what I value most? Boon felt a cold that wasn't related to the mountain air. Grimly, and pointed to the gun before pointing to Boon's horse, which was still saddled and waiting at the village's edge. Finally, his finger found the faded photo in Boone's shirt pocket, and he wrapped the belt around his waist. Ayana muttered, man always knows. He said, a picture of his parents, the only thing left of his family. Bones will expose what you attempt to conceal from yourself? Keurig moved forward, talking quickly and pointing to the strewn bones. He spoke in a difficult, even derisive tone, and several other locals nodded in accord. My cousin claims this. Is folly? Ayana clarified, referring to whatever he was saying. Since no white man would sacrifice, he believes you will choose to leave rather than give up what matters to you. Boon, anything genuine for an Apache woman, examined what Nalnish had pointed out. His horse stood for liberty, the capacity to travel any place, be anyone. His gun gave him security and the ability to protect himself in a dangerous environment. The picture was his. His history, his identity, the final link to his former self. Yet Boon became aware of something unexpected as he stood there among faces illuminated by dying embers. None of the pistol was merely a tool. The horse was merely an animal, and those things felt just as significant as they had the day before. Even though it was a priceless shot, it depicted people who had already passed away. What mattered were the living. The woman standing next to him was important. She was caught between two worlds as a result of his behavior, and I knew what I had to. Boone said, "Sacrifice," and took the picture out of his shirt while his parents looked back at him. Him from the old paper. His mother was sweet and loving, while his father was harsh and haughty. This picture had been his for years, anchor, a reminder of his origins and his intended identity, but clinging to the past meant he couldn't. Boone approached the fire pit and knelt next to the blazing embers, saying, "I sacrificed my old life in order to embrace the future. The man I was, the plans I had, the world I knew," he shouted, his voice echoing throughout the village. "I offer it." He put the picture on the coals and the paper ignited, all up to become the man Ayanna deserves. The loss struck him like a physical blow, and he instantly curled and turned dark as his parents' faces vanished into smoke. Hit, but he didn't recoil or turn away. The town burst into startled whispers, and Cowboy appeared astounded at the gesture, but what really stood out was Ayanna's expression, one of wonder and something more profound, something that appeared to be the start of love. Nalnish spoke once more, this time with a reverence that had not been present before. "You have proven yourself worthy." Ayanna interpreted, tears running down her cheeks. "Not before. Because you grasped what the challenges really meant. Not because you finished them. Without insight, strength is worthless. Without sacrifice, wisdom is pointless." The grandmother, Imala, who had been so antagonistic before, came over to Boone holding something. The brand-new shirt was composed of soft deer hide and embellished with elaborate beading. She offered it to him and spoke quietly. "She greets them with 'Welcome to the household,'" Ayanna muttered. Something changed inside Boone as he put the shirt on. The rancher who had there were no longer any ridden into this valley. A man who had chosen love above independence and connection took his place. Over autonomy, the future over the past. Cowboy came closer, his previous animosity supplanted by reluctant respect. He talked English to Boone for a few seconds. Simply put, "You fight like Apache." She decided to okay. Boone held Ayanna's hand as the town started to cheer all around them. The she still had his grandmother's blanket slung over her shoulders. However, currently its meaning had changed since that frigid morning. It was now just how the Apache had always perceived it. A promise, dedication, and the decision to prioritize the warmth of another person over your own. "Do you feel bad about it?" Quietly, Ayanna inquired, "letting go of your former existence." Boone glanced, seeing his future mirrored in her dark eyes. Although that wasn't the life he had intended, he had selected. And occasionally he came to the realization that the best choices were those that were made from the heart rather than the brain. He murmured, drawing her in, "That's the only thing I regret. Why did it take me so long to figure out what that blanket meant, truly intended?" Boone was aware that tomorrow would present additional difficulties as the festivities went on all around them. Finding his place in this close-knit group, understanding Apache customs, and establishing a respectful marriage instead of only the situation. However, tonight, with his grandmother's blanket wrapped around Ayanna's hand, he felt at home, something he hadn't felt in years on both of their shoulders. If you like the two help bring more stories like this, think about sending a super chat. Click the video on the screen now to listen to an even better narrative with a twist than this one. It is so potent that it will permanently alter your perception of fairness. The following story will demonstrate to you what occurs when vengeance and kindness clash in unexpected ways.